My name is Marjorie Erickson. I have a degree in landscape design, and I consider myself very fortunate to have been able to visit some historically significant gardens, and I enjoy bringing them to people. So today we are going to visit the very famous garden of the very famous French Impressionist painter, Claude Monet. Here we are at the foot of Monet's garden in spring. This path here is called the Grande Allée. It leads to the main door of the house. When I first saw this garden, one of the things that struck me was that this garden was created by somebody that today's gardener can relate to. I had just been touring Versailles and other royal gardens, and this garden has a real personal feeling to it. Unlike the royal gardens, it was not created with unlimited funds. When Monet first found this farmhouse in 1883 in the village of Giverny, he had been in such serious financial straits he'd had to send letters to friends and associates begging for money. He had a large family to worry about. He had 2 children by his wife Camille, who had died, and his partner Alice Ochede had 6 children, and her husband had gone bankrupt and abandoned her. His current rental house had flooded so badly they had to navigate the ground floor by boat. Things were not good. So Monet told Alice he was getting on the train and he wouldn't return until he'd found a decent place for the family to live. He investigated villages along the Seine River Valley for several days. No luck. Then he found the tiny village of Giverny, very rural, only about 300 people. But he liked the surrounding landscape, which was pretty important for a plein air painter who liked to paint out in the countryside. He got off the train, walked around, and found this empty farmhouse and orchard in the middle of town. And he rented it. But when the time came to move, there was not enough money for them all to get on the train. His art dealer had to wire money to pay Alice's train ticket to Giverny. So indeed, this garden was not created with unlimited funds, at least not in the beginning. My second impression of this garden is that it was created by somebody who loved plants, especially flowers. Look at the profusion here. When they got to Giverny, the family started gardening immediately. They needed food, but they also planted flowers. Monet wrote his art dealer a month later that he was too busy settling in and gardening to do any painting, but that the planting would give him flowers to paint on rainy days. Monet reported of this time in their lives. He said, "All of us worked in the garden. I dug, planted, weeded, and hoed myself. In the evenings, the children watered." Monet was a true gardener. He had garden buddies who he exchanged plants with, went to garden shows with, talked about new plants with, always on the lookout for plants, new plants for his garden. He ordered plants from mail order catalogs. He gave garden tours to visitors and friends alike and toured his gardens daily. I have a feeling at least some of these activities would sound pretty familiar to gardeners of today. And then there's the inescapable impression from seeing this garden that this garden was created by somebody who loved and knew how to use color. So here we are again at the foot of the Grande Allée in summer. Monet declared himself good for only 2 things in life: painting and gardening. He started learning about both at the same time as a teenager. He drew caricatures, and his father was a wholesale food producer, and he helped him maintain his garden. He once said, "I perhaps owe having become a painter to flowers." For Monet, the art of the garden and the art of painting were interrelated passions. He composed his garden as though it were a painting. It was in effect a living painting, which provided the subjects for many, many oil paintings. There were 2 acts of artistic creation involved here, the garden and the paintings. And in the end, Monet considered his garden his most beautiful masterpiece. So here's the layout. The garden is about 5 acres large, and it's located about 45 miles northwest of Paris. It, of course, has been restored since Monet's time in what's considered a very successful restoration. This is where we were in the previous photo, looking down the Grande Allée toward the front door. This whole big rectangle here is called the Clos Normand, the enclosed Normandy garden, since we're in Normandy, France. This is where the train tracks ran, and also a little road. The train is gone today, but the road is bigger. And in order to get to the other part of the garden, the Japanese water garden, you need to go into a tunnel under the road and then come up in the Japanese water garden and take the stroll around the pond. These two gardens are very, very different. In the Japanese garden, you're talking curvy, curvy, curvy. In the Clos Normand, you're talking straight line, straight line, straight line. In the Clos Normand, they think that Monet was inspired by his friend Gustave Caillebotte, another Impressionist painter, to create these long rectangular plant beds. They call them plant bands today. They're long, narrow, parallel flower beds, which help create long perspective lines, giving the illusion of infinity. Then, after creating these rectangular beds, Monet combined plants by color, building an impressionist pattern in this garden of blocks of color. The longer bands, like these along the Grande Allée, maybe they were the more sophisticated colors, maybe darker near the house and blending away to lighter further away. In these beds here, these are called the paint box beds. They're very small beds, so he could experiment with these much easier than with the longer beds. So he could observe the effects of blocks of color and experiment with a greater variety of colors each season here. Each bed would be planted with a different color plant, just mostly one plant, one color. And they'd be planted like dabs of color side by side for the eye to mix, just the way he painted. So here's the plant band. You could see how this could be useful to a painter. It would give you a great sense of perspective. The path lines moving to infinity, the flowers getting smaller and smaller. Also, here's the paint box beds under these trellises here. In the spring, you can see the purples here next to the blues. It's early in the season. He loved pairing a run of blue across a path from a bed of reds. But when I saw this, I thought, but this seems, all these lines, this seems rather formal for the guy who used to like to paint meadows. But you see, when you look at the garden from the side, in the distance, the path lines all blend away, and you wind up with a sea of color. I think this photo shows well what Monet was doing, creating his garden to be like a painting. I think that with these tulip flower heads, it's like every flower head is a brushstroke of paint in an Impressionist painting. Basically, the soil was Monet's canvas, and he was painting with flowers and with bits of foliage. And it was the effect of the whole picture he was making that mattered. So what kind of gardening techniques did Monet use to plant his garden to be like a painting? In the first place, he used a sheer profusion of flowering plants, all crowded together so to appear to be brushstrokes. Today, when the gardeners plant this garden, they don't even tease out the roots when they plant the various plants. They just cram the plants in. Although, in order to keep the blooming going, they do have to remove the spent flowers daily so that the blooming is maintained as much as possible. Another thing Monet did is use clear, pure, brilliant color like this dahlia. We're not talking muddy tones, we're not talking earth colors, but clear, pure, brilliant color. Then he would plant these colors in masses use the colors in masses, drifts of color to be mixed by the eye. Today, the beds are a little more mixed than they were in Monet's time. You'll be able to see that in the summertime beds. That's because they need to be able to keep them looking good for the public every single day, even when one type of flower is spent. But they try very hard to use the types of plants and the colors that Monet used. So then what he would do, after he had his drifts of color, he would scatter wildflowers around to come up where they pleased and fill in any bare spaces around the masses of color. He would collect seed out in the countryside like forget-me-nots, wild violets, wild daisies, and poppies. Here you can see filled in with forget-me-nots or maybe little flowers like violas. Monet called wildflowers the soul of the garden. And if a flower came up the wrong color, so what? It was the whole effect, the whole picture that mattered.